Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cameras and Coffee. And today we're going to ask the question, what would happen to camera makers if there is in fact a recession in the next year or so? But first, the intro. So today I am enjoying a wonderful Costa Rica natural Caturra from Airship Coffee. Airship has become, if not my favorite, one of my two favorite roasters here in the US. This has notes of blackberry, lime juice, and vanilla. While I don't actually taste all of those, it is still really good. All right, so while I pull up my sources here, apologize for the down attire today. We just got back from a 9-day vacation to San Francisco and Alaska, and I gained 8 pounds and none of my clothes fit anymore. So, all right. So so if your news feed every morning when you wake up and look at your news is like mine, then what you'll see are three repeating stories: imminent recession, possible recession, definitely not going to be a recession, in those three orders, in that order, over and over again. No one knows whether or not we're headed into a recession. The data keep changing. But it got me thinking over the course of the last week, what would a global recession mean for the camera industry? And I went into this with a theory that nothing good is the answer. My best guess was that a global recession would mean one or more camera makers might go out of business. We'd see camera makers doubling down on the safe approach to things, which is to say lots of features and functionality, no real innovation in the design of the cameras, and so on and so forth. But there's no way to really prove that. Anyone who prove what's happening in the future, anyone who tells you they know, is lying. And I'm going to tell you right now, I don't know what's coming, but if we look at what has happened in the past, we get some hints about what could happen in the future. So I looked up some different definitions of what is a global recession so that I could have something to work off of. And I happen to like which entity was it? Hold on. The IMF definition, which is defines a global recession as a decline in annual per capita real world GDP, which is the purchasing power parity weighted GDP, backed up by a decline or worsening for one or more of the 7 other global macroeconomic indicators, which are industrial production, trade, capital flows, oil consumption, unemployment rate, per capita investment, and per capita consumption. I'll link the Wikipedia article that I'm stealing this from in the video's description for you. Okay, so according to that definition, since World War II, there have been 4 global recessions: 75, 82, 91, and 09. Okay, there are other competing definitions that indicate up to 6. We're going to go with this one. So it just makes things a little bit easier. So I sat down and I started thinking, well, let's see, mid-70s, early 80s, early 90s, and late aughts. All of those coincide with periods that I would say didn't have spectacular cameras. That was my knee-jerk reaction. But then I started thinking about, well, actually, during those recessions, what cameras were being developed? And those would have been the cameras that would have been released in the 2 to 3 years-ish after the recession. And now if we look at those, now actually we are looking at some very interesting cameras. So the general conceit here is that I went into this thinking a global recession would be catastrophic for the cameras in the future, during and after it. And I came out of this research thinking, well, maybe not. Maybe a global recession will spur creativity. And I think there might be something to that idea. But to say that a global recession necessarily has a causal relationship with increased creativity in camera design is not correct. It's a correlation, not a causation, because each of those global recessions coincided with increases in manufacturing capabilities, transportation capabilities, and specifically transportation as it relates to globalism and the way that materials could be sourced from much further afield, brought to a facility and turned into something. Also, so production, manufacturing processes, transportation, and design. So in each of those periods, there were significant advances in computerized design and logistics that would make it easier for more exciting cameras to be developed, more technologically advanced, more streamlined, easier to build, things like that. So I think there are 4 coincident factors, and certainly many more. And if you have other factors you think contributed to what we're about to look at, by all means, please indicate those in your comments. But if we look at a period of a global recession with improved computer technology, improved logistics and transportation, and improved manufacturing procedures, now we're looking at, let's take a look at some of the cameras from the late 70s. We're going to use Canon as an example because, oops, wrong button. They are a really good example of this point. So if we look at 1976, the year after the first IMF global recession, what Canon camera was released? If you said the Canon AE1, you would be correct. And that kicked off the entire A series, and I'll get to it eventually. Here it is. Okay, so AE1 76, and then the rest of the A's. The Canon new F1, the F1 rather, came out in, there it is, in 71. But the F1N also came out in 76, and then the new F1 came out in 82. All right, so what about the next global recession, 1982? What did Canon release after that? Starting in 1983, the T series. T50s through T90 came out in the mid-80s. All of those, even though they were FD mount, yeah, they were significant improvements and advancements over the A-series cameras. And the A-series cameras themselves had been significant improvement over things like the FTB, TX, and EF. Also, one really interesting thing is that in that late 70s period, Canon went from like this jumbled naming convention to something which was a little bit more streamlined and made a little bit more sense. So there was some creative thinking about how to better engage consumers through the marketing of the cameras. A necessity when you're coming out of a global recession. Okay. What about Nikon? Nope, that's EOS. What about Nikon? Here we go. So released in 1977, so a little bit later, we see the EL2 followed by the FE and FE2 into the early 80s. Okay, Nikon's a little bit, it's not quite as easy to paint the exact same picture with Nikon as with Canon, but it still generally holds up, especially with the 80s and the 90s. So in the mid-range cameras, I think, are a better example. That was the mid-range electronic. The standard mid-range cameras would have been in 77 the FM, then in 82 the FM2, right? Correlating, generally speaking, with those 2 IMF recessions. And then also in the entry level, we had things like the EM in 79 and the FG in 82. And at the top end, we see the F3 coming out in 1980, but certainly having been developed well in advance of that. Then we get into the early 1980s, and we see even more advancements in the beginning of things like autofocus. We get into the 90s, and we see a refinement of autofocus, the release of Canon's EOS mount, and so on and so forth. In the late aughts, 2009, following that, we really see the shift of SLR-based digital cameras to where mirrorless digital cameras started to come in. And now, as we're sitting here in 2022, mirrorless cameras are the ubiquitous model for interchangeable lens cameras. SLRs, with the exception of Ricoh, insofar as we know, are functionally dead. Actually, literally dead. No, if anyone is going to make a DSLR going forward, it's only going to be Ricoh. So I would make the argument that whenever you have 4 factors, a recession, which is going to drive a creative approach to increasing revenue, an advance in technology, which will allow more creative and interesting and thoughtful camera design, an increase in manufacturing capability, and an increase in the ability of logistics and transportation to more efficiently allow materials to get to manufacturing and then to market, then what we set ourselves up for is a very interesting period of camera growth and competition in the years following an economic downturn. Doesn't do us any good right now, but in a few years it could be very interesting. What do we have right now? The potential for a global recession. It does, correct me if I'm wrong, if you guys feel differently, but it certainly feels like we're kind of hanging on by a thread. The data today does look, literally from this morning, does look a little bit more optimistic than it has in the weeks past. An advance in technology. AI has become incredibly powerful. And there's two different ways that AI can be used in cameras. To train the cameras to function better during use, right? We can use AI to train autofocus and then send out updates to the autofocus software so that it's continually improving through very advanced training. I think another even better way to use AI for cameras is to train the AI to design the cameras. Take human designs and then refine them and improve them. Here's this architecture for this chip. How can we make, Mr. or Mrs. AI, if whatever they're called, show us how we can make the architecture on this chip less expensive to build, more efficient, easier to cool down so that we can run continuous shooting and video for longer, things like that. How can we better optimize the placement of the electronic components in these cameras within the camera housing to make them lighter, free up space for more SD cards or a bigger battery, whatever it happens to be. So AI can serve two really good purposes there. How do we make the camera work better? How do we design the camera to be better out of the box? Manufacturing, anyone here who's in any way, shape, or form familiar with any of the modern manufacturing practices, laser cutting, 3D printing, additive, especially 3D printing from different methods, whether it's with metal or plastic or things like that, laser etching, the types of manufacturing that exist today for electronics and hardware components are so much more advanced than what we saw in any of the previous recession periods, that the ability of manufacturers to make really fascinating cameras in the future is not even fully conceived yet. And then for logistics and transportation, that's kind of where we're suffering due to all of the supply chain issues. But once those start to get worked out, once we figure out ways to make, for instance, I know I've read that Amazon is working on making warehouses robotic, so that you place an order, it's no longer some poor guy or girl who's got a really rough job busting their butt to make their quota. Now it's a robot going exactly to where the things are, picking them up and putting them in your box. Advances like that will really help to make the supply chain and logistics much more manageable, especially if we can figure out ways to make a lot of the transportation more automated, like cross-oceanic voyages and things like that. At least not to take away the jobs of the merchant marines, but to make the actual transportation more effective and efficient. And that's something that the train companies and cargo shipping companies and plane cargo companies all look at regularly, because the more efficient that they can make their processes and their transportation, the more profitable they are, the faster they get materials in and out of their systems. So I'm going to argue that if those four factors are really important to having creative and exciting camera design and development, that we are primed to see a new generation in the future of very exciting cameras in the coming years, starting in 2023, end of 23 and into 2027 and beyond. So I know that there's a lot of gloom and doom, the recession is going to destroy everything talk, but I wanted to take a different perspective, which is that in this little niche market that we all enjoy, there is the potential for not complete gloom and doom. Sun on the other side of the clouds, partly cloudy. That's going to be our forecast, partly cloudy. Have a good day, everybody, and I'll see you in the next Cameras and Coffee. Steinbeck's been sleeping since we picked him up from the kennel. He is. Yes, I know you're exhausted. Yes, you are. You are very tired. Go back to sleep, pup.